Welcome to Abnormal Psychology. This is our lecture on personality disorders. Everybody probably is aware that we can see very personality traits that are very challenging that might appear in childhood. But those challenging personalities will typically change over time, and most children will grow up to have personality styles that are pretty easily melded into the general society. But our personality disorders represent some extremes of personality that end up being very stable and consistent over time. So typically they will show up in adolescence or in early adulthood, and then they will continue for the rest of their life, typically until death. And we're going to go into the different types of personality disorders. But first, I want to talk about some of the patterns that are similar across all of the personality disorders. So A, there is a consistent pattern where their inner experience, the way they see things, as well as their behavior, deviates from what is typically expected in their culture. And we will see this happen in a number of different ways. And to count for the criteria, we need to see it happen in at least two different ways. So one, the way they think. This may be their perceptions and their interpretations of themselves, or how they see other people, or how they interpret events. It may be in how they express emotion. So this could be the range of emotion that they experience, whether it's they experience a lot of emotion or only a little bit of emotion. It could be how intensely they experience emotions, or how inappropriate or appropriate their emotions are. And we also talk about a term being how labile are their emotions. So labile means, do they have a lot of up and down fluctuations in a small period of time? Are they easily triggered from being maybe happy or calm into now being enraged or now being incredibly sad? So think about it as a roller coaster ride of emotion that doesn't take a lot to get triggered. So being labile. You'd also look at their interpersonal functioning, how stable are their relationships, how challenging are those relationships, as well as their ability to control their impulses, especially impulses to do something problematic or to act out in a way that might be problematic. If you remember, we talked about in the past, they divided up the personality disorders and they had those separate from all of the other kinds of disorders. So we used to have an axis 1 condition and an axis 2 conditions, which is where the personality disorders were placed. And the idea was that personality disorders are very, very different from all of the other kinds of disorders. For example, if we compare it to depression, depression is thought to be episodic, where they have these periods of depression and then they get better. And in contrast, personality disorders show up early in life, and then they are how they interact all the time across situations and across the different individuals that they connect with. So this is getting into criterion B, the pattern of behaviors or ways of thinking or their emotional and interpersonal reactions. These patterns are consistent across the kinds of personal experiences they have with others, as well as their social situations. They're consistent across time, and they're consistent across all of the different types of people that they interact with. So what does that mean? That means that the person who has a personality disorder, they're going to behave this way with friends. They'll behave this way at work. They'll behave this way at home. They'll behave this way if they go to the store. They have very little ability to change how they are interacting in the world. So they behave this way across time, from starting early in life till death. They behave this way with all of the different people in the world, and they behave this way in all the different kinds of situations that they encounter themselves in. So this enduring pattern should lead to some type of clinically significant distress or impairment. And we have said this for all of the disorders we've talked about so far. But it's important here that you recognize that we're saying it should either be clinically significant distress or impairment. And that either is really important because people with personality disorders may not think that they have a problem. We talk about personality disorders as being ego-syntonic. And I think of this as, or a way of remembering it is to think these are consistent with their ego, meaning they're consistent with how they see themselves. So they don't have distress because of the behavior that they're engaging in, because they don't see them as having done anything problematic. So if they end up being seen in therapy, they're not being seen because they believe they have a problem that needs to change. They're either being seen because they're court ordered or because they're wanting help coping with the negative feelings they have because the ways other people treat them. So if you hear that distinction, it's a really important one. They might feel bad because they think other people treat them badly, but they are less likely to see that their behavior is causing some of the bad treatment that they're experiencing. And again, the behaviors that we're seeing, they are long lasting. They may not have been diagnosed earlier in life, but if you go back and look at the behaviors, you can see that they existed in early adulthood and maybe even in adolescence. And if you are working with somebody and you are considering the diagnosis now, you have to see that those behaviors have been stable for at least a year. And there's going to be one diagnosis that is an exception to this rule, and that's antisocial personality disorder. That one that you cannot diagnose prior to age 18. But the other ones you can diagnose early in life, but before you can diagnose, you have to see that those behaviors have been consistently present for at least a full year. When we talk about the personality disorders, we break them into 3 general clusters, and then we talk about the individual personality disorders within those clusters. So what you want to be able to do is you would want to be able to describe what does cluster A look like, and how is cluster A different from cluster B, different from cluster C, what is similar, what is different about the clusters. And then from there, you'd want to be able to say which disorders fall within each of the clusters, and you'd want to be able to talk about the individual disorders that are within the clusters. So this would be being able to say cluster A is odd and eccentric. These are the 3 disorders that go into them, and then describe each of the 3 disorders. So let's take a minute and go into the clusters and go into what these may look like. First of all, it's important to say that over 15% of US adults can qualify for at least one personality disorder in the United States. So that's actually a really considerable proportion of the population. Again, if you think about our class on exam day, we typically have anywhere from 250 students to 300 students enrolled in this class. So if we had 300 students, we might see that at least 45 students in our class would qualify for one of these personality disorders. So it's a significant number of people in the United States. Cluster A. Cluster A is the group that we consider very odd and eccentric. And within this category, we have paranoid personality disorder, schizoid, and schizotypal. And we'll go through each of those in turn in a minute. Cluster B is more dramatic. They tend to have a lot of emotional lability, or being very labile. Remember, labile means they have this roller coaster ride of emotions where from minute to minute they can have vastly different emotions. This group tends to be very erratic, very emotional, and very dramatic. And we'll talk about each of the ones in this cluster in turn as well. And then finally, cluster C. This is the cluster that we typically will refer to as being very anxious and very fearful. And here we have avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. And if you look at the prevalence rates of these different clusters, roughly 6% would fall into cluster C and 6% would fall into cluster A. Only 1.5% of the population falls into cluster B, but as you'll notice as we describe the different clusters, cluster B is the one that we will often hear about, we will often see portrayed on TV, and that's because this is a cluster that their extreme emotional ups and downs often cause a lot of challenges for people around them, which is why they get so much more attention, even though they're pretty rare. The other thing I want to say before we move on is if we think about these clusters, they are useful, they're helpful and help in getting us to think about how the different disorders within each cluster are similar. But the structure has not been consistently validated in studies. So we continue to use the structure, but you should recognize that there's still a lot of overlap between all of the clusters, and it's not as easily differentiated as the cluster system might make it appear. Let's get into our first disorder, paranoid personality disorder. A general description of this group is they are excessively mistrustful and they are suspicious of others, and this is without having any reasonable justification for their suspiciousness. So here they have this pervasive distrust, they're incredibly suspicious, and you look for this to show up in at least 4 different areas. So one, suspecting that others are trying to exploit, harm, or deceive them. They may be preoccupied with doubts that other people are loyal to them or with concerns about people being trustworthy. And again, I want to emphasize all of these are in the context of it not being warranted, that they are interpreting other people as having malevolent intentions of being wanting to do them harm, but there's nothing to justify or to support those beliefs. 3, they often will be really reluctant to confide in other people because they have a fear that people will use the information against them and use it to harm them. So they tend to be very secretive, very private. They don't want to share information with others. But this can even be information that most of us would find pretty reasonable to share. For example, if you met someone and you asked them where were they born, they may be hesitant to say, well, I was born in Chicago, but most of us would think that that's a pretty innocuous piece of information that you could share freely. People with paranoid personality disorder will read threats and hidden meanings into remarks that most of us would think of as being benign or non-important. They will hear those same remarks and assume that there was something threatening in them intended for them. They consistently will hold grudges against other people. And again, this is not simply some major event that happened where somebody maybe did really betray them in a horrid way. This can be a slight misunderstanding. Maybe they tried to say hello to you in the hallway and you had in your earphones, so you didn't hear it and you didn't respond. And so now it could be 2 years later and they're still holding a grudge against you for not speaking when they spoke to you. They also tend to see that their character is being attacked or their reputation is being attacked. And then when they feel this way, they are likely to attack in response as a way of protecting themselves. But again, when you look at these situations that they will use as the basis for their attack, most others would look at those situations and not think that it had been an attack, and so their response in attacking someone else seems unwarranted. And if they are in a relationship, what you will often see is that they have repeated concerns that their partner is not being faithful to them, that their partner is having an affair, despite there being zero evidence that that is what's actually happening. So if you have all of those kinds of beliefs, there's a lot of things we would expect for how they're going to actually interact when they're moving about in the world. So some of the common things we will see is that people with this disorder will often appear as if they're really cold-hearted and they don't care about others. They don't seem to be very loving towards others, and they always are guarded, on watch for something going wrong. something being done to them that would be an indication of somebody threatening them or being harmful to them. And when they do this, they often will, on the surface, appear as if they are being very rational and that they are not allowing their emotions to interfere with their assessment of the situation. But then when you get down to it, they tend to also be extremely hostile. They are very stubborn. They're unwilling to kind of bend or make compromise. And then they will often talk to other people with a hostile, sarcastic tone that can be very off-putting. And then if something upsets them, they actually could be quite labile, where they're going from maybe being at a normal level to suddenly being angry, hostile, and attacking to other people. Now, if you know anyone like this, or if you can even imagine someone like this, it's also pretty easy to imagine that other people interacting with this person are going to be hostile to them in response. You know, if somebody gives you a sarcastic, nasty comment when you try to say something in a meeting, after that happens a few times, you're likely to be less friendly to them and maybe even become hostile to them. Most people would see that as a reasonable response to their bad behavior. But for somebody with paranoid personality disorder, this hostility that they get from others then becomes a feedback loop, which just confirms to them that they have every reason in the world to mistrust others. Because they cannot trust other people, they tend to be very self-sufficient. They don't want to have anyone controlling any of their actions. They want to be able to control everything on their own. And if in their relationships with other people, they feel the need to control the actions, the movements of others. As you might imagine, they tend to be rigid. They criticize others. They're also unable to hear criticisms about themselves, and so they blame other people for any of the mistakes that they might make or any of their shortcomings. And they're likely to stereotype others and kind of put people into these very simplistic categories of kind of, oh, that person's an idiot or this person's lazy, as a way of simplifying the world into the various categories of people that they cannot trust and do not like. So those are the symptoms that we look for paranoid personality disorder, and those are some of the ways that we might see those symptoms show up. Some of the other criteria for diagnosing this is, one, it cannot be that we only see these behaviors when they're in a psychotic episode or when they're in a mood episode that has psychosis. You know, people that are experiencing psychosis are prone to be argumentative. They might be complaining quite a bit. They might have a lot of quiet hostility or being aloof from others. So we're not trying to add diagnoses to somebody who already has a diagnosis. So if they already have a mood disorder with psychosis, or if the symptoms only show up during psychosis, then that would not count as a paranoid personality disorder. So again, paranoid personality disorder, adding personality disorder on the end implies that this is their behavior all of the time, and it's been there since early in life. It continues throughout their life, and they behave this way throughout the various situations they're in. But a psychotic episode or mood disorder with psychosis, we should see that they have periods of time where they might act this way, but then when the episode is over, they go back to normal and we don't see these symptoms. So that's part of what we would use to help differentiate these. We see that there are times where those with personality disorder may act out even more than normal. This may be particularly if they are under a lot of stress. They may experience some brief psychotic episodes, and this could be from a few minutes to lasting for a few hours. And we do know that paranoid personality disorder appears to have a relationship to delusional disorder and to schizophrenia, and that some of these behaviors might actually be a premorbid antecedent for delusional disorder and schizophrenia, meaning that we might be seeing these behaviors because they're actually going to move into having a more significant diagnosis like schizophrenia. These individuals are at higher risk for major depressive disorder, substance abuse. They're also at higher risk for also qualifying for schizotypal, schizoid, narcissistic, avoidant, and borderline personality disorder. And we also see that they have higher rates of paranoid personality disorder in families where someone also has schizophrenia or has a persecutory type of a delusional disorder. So what to think about all this? What this means is they're likely to have some genetic relationship where there's some genetic predisposition, and for members of the family, some have moved on to having schizophrenia, and for others, they have moved on into having paranoid personality disorder. And so there's something that is a biological and likely genetic underpinning of these disorders that's similar, but for a variety of reasons, some develop this disorder while others might develop delusional disorder and others might develop schizophrenia. The second disorder that we'll talk about here is schizoid personality disorder. And for schizoid, I like to remind myself, think of schizoid as void. They are devoid of emotion. So with schizoid personality disorder, we see a pervasive pattern where they are detached in their social relationships, and they tend to have a restricted range of affect that begins very early in life. It is pervasive across contexts, across individuals, and across time. So what does this mean? They tend to have very little interest in having social relationships, and they tend to have very little emotional expression. That's what we mean by a restricted range of affect. So they don't enjoy close relationships. They typically don't enjoy or particularly have a desire for things like being in a family or having a family of their own. They typically will choose to be on their own and do things in a more solitary manner. They typically have very little interest in sexual experiences. They will, if they engage in behaviors, they don't enjoy them or have much pleasure in their activities. Very often they will not have friends. If they do have friends, it might be just a significant first degree relative or one person that they happen to have as a confidant. But they don't have a lot of interest in making friends or having many friends. And for some, they may not even have interest in those connections with their first degree relatives. Now, if you think about people who don't care about relationships with others, it's probably not surprising to realize that these individuals also don't respond to praise, and they're also not terribly concerned when they are criticized by other people. So they typically don't have a lot of emotional connection. They don't get upset if people are angry or unhappy with them because they don't care about those social relationships. They tend to have very little emotional reactions to what's going on around them. And as you can imagine, they tend to have very little motivation to do any of the things that might make others happy and make people want to be closer to them. Now, in those cases where people have reported that they do have an emotional connection to others, then those individuals do also experience some painful emotions. So if somebody has schizoid personality disorder, but they do have some emotional connection to, say, a parent or a sibling, if something happens in that relationship, if something goes wrong, or if that person passes away, they are still likely to have pain about that. But there's question about, does the depth of the pain they experience compare to others who don't have schizoid personality disorder? And it's likely that that pain is not as deep, but they do actually still experience some of that emotion. These individuals, as far as some behaviors you would see, they are likely to not express any anger. It's probably likely they don't feel much anger, even if somebody is doing something to really provoke them. Instead of getting angry in response, they're likely just to respond with passivity if they respond at all. They typically are low achievers. They will find that it's very difficult to be in a workplace or to stay interested in doing work. Um, Now, perhaps if they are in a workspace where they are allowed to work very independently, they might be more successful. But if you think about it, a lot of what we do for work is connected to the feedback we get from others. And so if you are someone who has zero interest in what others think and feel, you don't have any desire to have praise from others, you don't feel connected to others, then it may be very difficult for this person to be motivated enough to do the kinds of things that would need to happen to maintain a career. Again, there are some of these cases that appear to be a premorbid antecedent for delusional disorder or for schizophrenia. And when we look at comorbidities, this group is often likely to also have comorbid diagnoses of schizotypal or paranoid or avoidant personality disorders. So we'll talk about these other ones soon. Similarly to what we said with with paranoid personality disorder, there's an increased prevalence of schizoid personality in family members that also have schizophrenia or in family members that have schizotypal personality disorder, which would again give you a hint that there's probably an underlying biological and or genetic mechanism that's increasing the risk of all of the family members. And we know that this is a disorder where men are more likely to have schizoid personality disorder, and they are more likely to be more severely impaired compared to women who have it. So some of the differences here from what we talked about with paranoid personality disorder is paranoid personality disorder tends to have a lot of a lot of emotion around of anger, but they also tend to have some unusual thoughts about the way other people might be treating them and assuming that people are trying to do them harm. With schizoid personality disorder, they do not have these kinds of concerns about other people. They simply don't really care. And also in comparison to one we'll talk about in a minute being schizotypal, these individuals do not have unusual thought processes. So their thinking is relatively typical, but their interest in having social connections with others and their level of emotionality is pretty different from any of the other ones we talk about. And our last one in this category is schizotypal personality disorder. So for schizoid, what I told you is think about being devoid of emotion, devoid of social connection. So for schizotypal, think typical of schizophrenia, because these individuals have this continuous pattern where they have these social and interpersonal interactions and deficits where they are uncomfortable or they have limited capacity for close relationships. So think about it, they are having interpersonal relationships or trying to have interpersonal relationships, but they're incredibly uncomfortable by them, and they don't seem to have the capacity to really engage well in close relationships. On top of that, they also have a lot of very eccentric, strange behavior, and they have some distortions in the way they think about the world and some of the kinds of perceptions they have about the world. So even though we haven't covered schizophrenia yet, from what you may already know about schizophrenia, this starts to feel like a kind of a very light version, perhaps, of schizophrenia. And that's why the typical of schizophrenia can be helpful in remembering what this one is. So here we're looking for at least 5 of the different symptom types to be met. The first one could be ideas of reference. And here, the ideas of reference is a concept that will come up again over and over as we talk about psychosis, because it's a way in which people might experience a psychotic symptom. So an ideas reference is where we have little tiny events that might occur in everyday life, and most of us would recognize that they are meaningless, they don't directly relate to us, but someone with schizotypal personality disorder might look at those insignificant events and think that they have something specific for them. So what might this be? This could be that they make eye contact with someone and then the person looks away and goes back to a conversation they were already having on their phone. And now this person believes that the person was talking and sharing information about them. They may also look at the professor in the front of the class, and every time the professor says, like, well, every time the professor makes one of those noises, they think that that is a message directly for them about something that's coming up on the test. Now, this also happens in schizophrenia, but with schizophrenia, people typically don't have any ways of testing out how logical is this belief set. So they have these beliefs and they think it must be true. But schizotypal personality disorder is not anywhere near as severe as schizophrenia. So here they may have this initial thought that, oh, I bet that person is having a conversation about me. Or I bet every time the professor says, it's a message for me. But they are also able to do some of the reality testing and recognize that that doesn't really make sense. That's not likely to be the case. So they have that thought, but they are able to challenge themselves and recognize that that thought isn't likely to be true. With schizophrenia, they have that thought and they do typically believe it is true. So that's ideas of reference. They may also have odd beliefs or magical thinking. So they might believe they have special powers, or they can do things that others can't do, such as they may think that they are clairvoyant, or they have telepathic properties. They may also have unusual perceptual experiences and illusions. So this is an important one. So they have these unusual perceptual experiences. And by perceptual experiences, I mean things that are coming through the five senses. So seeing, hearing, touch, smell, taste. And we will talk about this again when we talk about schizophrenia, because these are the same senses that people might have for hallucinations. But here, again, the person is not as severe. So they're not having full-blown hallucinations, but they are having these sensory experiences that lead them to believe something could be happening, but then they can do the reality testing and recognize that it's not. For example, I might stand in front of the class and I kind of think I'm hearing somebody call my name, but I can recognize it doesn't make any sense, that there's not actually anybody behind me talking. Somebody with schizophrenia would not be able to do that kind of reality testing. But somebody with schizotypal personality disorder might think that they're hearing somebody behind them. They may turn around, they see no one's behind them. They recognize that they're not hearing anything, that they just kind of thought they might be hearing something. So this is a really important distinction. So they are not having full-blown hallucinations. They may think they hear something, they may think they saw something, but they recognize, they're able to do the reality testing and recognize that it wasn't true, and they did not actually see or hear that event. They may also have odd thinking and odd speech. And this can show up a number of different ways. Their speech might be very vague, where it's difficult to tie down exactly what they're talking about because they speak in a really vague manner. They may be circumstantial, or they may over-elaborate on their point. And you can imagine that people in everyday life might do some of these things, but typically they don't do them all the time, or they don't do them and also have a lot of these other symptoms. So this would be one of the things you'd look for in combining them with them having at least 5 other symptoms. And of course, being very suspicious or being paranoid, having a lot of suspicious and paranoid thoughts. They may have inappropriate or restricted affect. And again, affect is how we show emotion. So restricted affect would be similar to what we talked about for schizoid personality disorder, where people don't show a lot of highs and lows in their emotion. So they don't show a lot of happiness nor a lot of sadness. They just seem very flat a lot of the time. Inappropriate, though, inappropriate affect might be having a response that is counter to the kind of affect we should have in a particular moment. So this could be if someone finds out their dog died, but they start laughing instead of the kind of response we'd expect to see. So restricted means they don't have a lot of the range of highs and lows. They tend to stay pretty much right in the center. And restricted can also be flat affect, but flat affect is typically thought of as even more severe, where they just have almost no emotional response on their face. And then inappropriate is responding kind of in the opposite way you'd expect for the situation that was happening. Very often people with schizotypal will have the way they behave or the way they look is a bit peculiar. It might be very eccentric or odd. This might be wearing clothing that seems different, and again, not stylistically, but maybe they just seem to be a little disheveled. They don't appear to be following some of the standard conventions for dress. They typically will have very few friends, very few people that they're close to. And they tend to be extremely, extremely anxious and anxious in social situations. So if you remember going back to social anxiety, we talked about that people will have a lot of anxiety around doing things where they could be judged as being defective or deficient in some way. And one of the distinctions is that they can do these things if they're by themselves, or they could do these same events if they were with close friends or people that they trust. But with schizotypal personality disorder, what you see is no matter how well they know these other people, they still show very high levels of social anxiety. And when you look at the cause for their social anxiety, it's not so much that they think so badly of themselves that they kind of think, well, I'm worthless, and if I do this, everybody will see. It's more about their paranoia about what other people are doing or thinking and the intentions of others. So as far as how this is related to other disorders, we know that there seems to be something that is connected, and there's probably an etiological relationship between schizotypal personality disorder and schizophrenia. However, there is only a tiny proportion of those with schizotypal personality disorder that eventually do go on to develop schizophrenia. So although there is a higher rate of schizotypal in families with members of schizophrenia, and although some of these individuals go on to develop schizophrenia, by and large, this is a related but distinct disorder. So there's probably some biological or genetic component that is triggering risk for both of these disorders. So that is the end of cluster A. If you need to take a break, this is a good time to take a break and then come back and restart the video here. So now let's move on to our cluster B diagnoses. Cluster B refers to the dramatic and eccentric types of personality dysregulation. And here, the first one we're going to talk about is antisocial personality disorder. I imagine many of you have heard of either a psychopath or a sociopath. There's even in the past been a dissocial personality disorder, and all of those have been past names that have been used to describe different versions of antisocial personality disorder. And sometimes people will hear antisocial and they think that we mean somebody who is introverted and doesn't like being around other people. But antisocial personality disorder is very, very different from that. So here we see a pervasive pattern of disregard and a disregard for others and a willingness to violate the rights of others. And this has occurred since age 15 and up. And you have to see that there are at least three of the different symptoms in order to qualify for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. So one, there has to be a history of unlawful behavior. So here, individuals may steal, they may sell drugs, destroy property, but they're repeatedly going forward and engaging in behaviors that they know are against the law, and they simply kind of don't care about the potential consequences of doing so. Also, deceitfulness. This can be as simple as repeated lying, but typically you also see that they engage in conning others and using aliases to con or to get away with other kinds of misbehaviors. Typically, they struggle with impulsivity and will often do things that reflect a lack of consideration about their future. So maybe getting mad at work and then they just quit their job and walk off, or they simply move out of their house and they do so without having any plans or anything in place to kind of pay their bills and take care of the things they need to take care of. But they've impulsively just responded and now they're trying to deal with the consequences of it. Irritability and aggressiveness. It is very common for individuals with antisocial personality disorder to have a history of many physical fights and assaults, as well as seeking out ways of being violent with others. So they may have a lot of fights in bars, they may be aggressive and even engage in sexual assault, frequently engage in domestic violence, and may be physically abusive to children or spouse. There's a reckless disregard for safety, and this is safety of others, but also safety of themselves. So they may, we already talked about like neglecting children, abusing family members, but they also might go out and drive really recklessly. They might drive after using a substance. They might operate heavy machinery when they are very, very drunk or inebriated. So just not being thoughtful about how their behaviors could result in their own injury. And a lack of remorse. So they have evidence of the way that they have hurt someone or mistreated someone else, and they simply don't care about that. They might beat somebody into a coma, and they simply don't care about the way that that has hurt someone else. And then a consistent irresponsibility. So failure to maintain their work obligations or to honor the kind of role obligations that most of us would think of as important. So if you have a child, making sure to have food for that child to eat, or if you take out a loan, making sure to repay that loan. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder may show a complete lack of interest in making sure that they have covered those responsibilities or taking care of the other people in their lives. To qualify for antisocial personality disorder, because this is such a significant diagnosis that has important ramifications, the bar is a little bit higher for this than it is for some of the other things that we've talked about. So if you remember, for the personality disorders, you can diagnose if somebody is under the age of 18, but they have to be at least a year old. That is not the case with antisocial, I'm sorry, the symptoms have to have been there for at least a year. For antisocial personality disorder, though, they have to be at least 18 years old before you can give them this diagnosis. So you cannot diagnose someone with antisocial personality disorder if they are still a minor. On top of that, you have to go back and look at their childhood behaviors, and you have to see that even before they were 15, they had behaviors that would have qualified them for diagnosis of conduct disorder. And so conduct disorder is a pretty severe childhood behavioral dysregulation where they may harm animals, they may be openly defiant, they may destroy property. So they're engaging in pretty significant problematic behaviors. They're doing it for a consistent period of time, and they're doing it without regard to the consequences they have to face. So this is much more severe than, say, a child that just has oppositional defiant disorder. These are pretty significant behaviors that they've engaged in prior to age 15. So for the diagnosis, you have to see that there's this pretty severe history of bad behavior that began prior to age 15, and now here they are at 18, and they're still engaging in all of these kinds of behaviors. So it's really implying that you have at least 4 years, if not more, of evidence of significant misbehavior that is a reckless disregard, that's defying the law, that's creating pain and suffering for many people, and before you could possibly give this diagnosis. So I say all that really to drive home that the severity of this diagnosis is taken very seriously, and so you have to see a long-standing, consistent trend in behavior before you would even consider giving this diagnosis. Because of the kinds of behaviors they engage in, we do see that there is a high likelihood that individuals with this disorder will die because of a premature death related to violence. So they're more likely to have committed suicide, to be killed by someone else, or to have a reckless accident that takes their life. The prevalence of this disorder is higher in men than women. However, there have been some questions about if antisocial personality disorder and one of the other ones we're talking about, borderline personality disorder, maybe these are similar disorders that simply are manifesting in ways that are more consistent with the ways we socialize men and women. But at this time, what we know is that it is more common in men, and that when we look at those men who have the most severe cases, for example, those with substance abuse disorders that are hospitalized or in clinics, if we look at those that are in prison, about 70% of those may have antisocial personality disorder. So among the most severe populations of those in prison or have substance abuse, a good proportion of them will also have antisocial personality disorder. And it's also much more likely that someone will have antisocial personality disorder if they have a childhood incidence of conduct disorder that began prior to the age of 10, and if they also have ADHD. So think about this as somebody who has ADHD, which is also associated with poor impulse control, and then they have conduct disorder. So they are damaging property, hurting animals, hurting people, and all of this is happening prior to age 10. That is a far worse trajectory and much more likely to result in antisocial personality disorder later in life. So individuals with antisocial personality disorder are also very likely to have high levels of substance abuse and to eventually end up hospitalized. I'm going to switch here to a video of a young man who has been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. And this young man is, I'm not certain of this, but I think he is from my hometown of Chicago based on the way he speaks and some of the streets that he notes. But I want you to pay attention to which symptoms that you're seeing with this individual, how long they've lasted, the questions the interviewer is getting at to assess whether or not he would qualify for antisocial personality disorder, and also to get a sense of to what extent do you believe he has any remorse or feels bad about any of the things that he has done.
Can you tell me a little bit about what's happened for you to come into the hospital this time?
Yeah, this is my first time coming to the hospital or a treatment center, period. And I had got to the point, you know, I'm selling drugs out on the street, dealing with a lot of people, crazy people out there, which, you know, because they had a sickness. But I didn't know I had the sickness because I was always, you know, distributing to them. And I just got to a point where I had just, my mind just got so bad and everything. I couldn't nobody tell me nothing. And I ain't care about nobody. I ain't care about myself. I ain't care about my mother, my father, my kids, and nothing. So it was like, it got so bad when I had put a gun up to my father's head. Then put my hands out on my mother's face, calling her out around her name.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like I ain't, anybody could took me out. And if they would have shot me or killed me, I wouldn't have cared.
When you were telling me when you were younger, under 15, you had all those fights, you ever have a fight with a weapon? That you were carrying a gun or a knife?
A knife?
A knife.
Yeah.
That was when you were under 15.
Yeah, that's when I was good. I had, my mother said she been working the courts. They gave me a break on a case like that. But I ain't got caught with 13-inch switchblades, throwing knives and everything. I ain't caught a lot of different things like that.
How old were you when that happened?
Like 11, 12 years old. Used to throw bricks at people, bust their heads, hit them with bottles and everything. I ain't care. Whatever it took to beat them, that's what I did.
Now, when you were doing that, were you really trying to hurt him?
Yeah, trying to hurt him. Because, like I said, I didn't have no feelings for nobody.
Mm-hmm.
When I felt like killing somebody, before I came in this hospital, when I felt like killing somebody, I didn't care about it.
When you were younger, less than 15, did you ever destroy property?
I used to see the bus drivers coming down Grand Avenue and opening up, once they open the bus door, throw bricks at them and everything and run.
How old were you when this happened?
10 and 11 years old. I was right down the street from the house, so I ain't had far to run. One time I took a paper machine. Once they had the papers in, I took it and dragged it in the boys' club, busted over, took the money out.
Out of the machine?
Yeah. How you break the machine that it had a top. I broke the top off, took the money out of the machine.
Was that something you do a lot when you were younger too, lying? Lying to people?
Yeah. Lying to get out of a whooping.
How about at school? Lying at school?
Yeah. I was lying daily at school because, I go right to school. Why wouldn't you at home? Why wouldn't you at school? I was sick. Go home. My mom was like, was you at school today? Yes, ma'am. I was at school. No, and I wasn't even at school. I was at home on the telephone watching TV, legs kicked up and everything.
Now, how about fires? I asked you that.
Yeah, I ain't did no major fires like burning buildings up and that. But I ain't tell you the other day, I used to set trash cans on fire, right?
Now, were you doing that to keep warm or?
No, I'm doing that just to see some fire, just for the hell of it.
So if it was important, valuable stuff in there, you didn't do it yet?
No. I used to steal from my daddy too, like his knives and stuff. My mother has a comic book collection, and from when they very first started making comic books, when I was in school, when my mother never lived no money, I used to take her comic books to school and sell her comic books. Comic books that was valuable, real valuable. I used to sell just for nothing, but she got it back though. But I ain't, as I was,
How about torturing animals or doing things to animals?
I ain't never abused no animals because I always did love animals because we always had animals. We always had pets, cats and dogs and everything. So I used to have a rabbit. I love animals. I wouldn't do nothing to no animal. But I do something to a person. I have hatred inside me. I don't care how much I beat somebody. I still don't get enough anger out because I still seem like the more I hit somebody, the more anger I get inside.
How much anger you think you got inside you? And what could you do? If you could just do whatever you want, how much anger would come out?
All right, put like this. The other day, before you came to talk to me, I was laying in my bed, and a guy sleeps next to me. He just was talking to me, and I got pissed off and told him something else to me. So I had jumped up out the bed. Now, this is in the hospital. Jumped up out the bed, and he jumped up. I just slammed him on his bed, started choking him, and didn't want to let go. It was like, I was just looking at his face and just choking him. And when so then some nurses came in, gave me some medicine, calm me down, right? But before the medicine calmed me down, he said something else to me. I hit him. Then the medicine finally calmed me down. But then,
when was the first time that you really started using drugs?
I used drugs when I was playing. That shit. I probably about 9, 10 years old.
What kind of drugs?
Smoked wild marijuana. And then, that's the first time I used a drug that I smoked, but alcohol is a drug too. First time I drug from alcohol, I think I was probably about 3 years old. My mother, she used to drink peppermint schnapps. This was, now this was like almost 24 years ago. And I took a bottle of peppermint schnapps and drunk. I hid in the closet and drunk. I was sick. My mother told me I was sick for like 4 or 5 days.
How old were you when you first started using it, though, to get drunk, or to get high?
First started, I was smoking marijuana when I was about like 10, 11 years old, 9, 10, something like that. Smoking marijuana in school, everybody. Once we grown.
Have you ever forced a woman to have sex?
No, so I have sisters, and I respect them. I respect all females. I wouldn't put myself in no category. I know people that did it though, and I want to kill them. Because I feel like a man doesn't have to do it.
The kind of work that you've done. You mentioned that at one point you're selling drugs. Is that the main kind of work that you've done?
Yeah.
Before? Selling drugs.
Yeah.
Most of the things most of the jobs that you've done, have they been things that weren't legal?
Yeah, I had a company though. I actually owned my own company though. I had a construction company, and it was an up and down thing. The weather was bad. You can do. I actually opened that company up because I got skills and trades from Job Corps. So I had opened that company up, and I got locked up. I got locked up by the state. So when I got locked up by the state, I was just.
You mean you were in prison?
Yeah.
What was that about?
I assaulted a woman, because she got up in my face and she acted like she was going to hit me. She was talking, she was arguing, and next thing I know, I just smacked her. I broke her nose. I had so much anger and stuff in me. It was just like a bomb. You see a bomb and it's just ticking. It's just a matter of seconds when the bomb blows up and you trying to get out of there. And the way I'm going, that bomb's going to blow up in me. I won't be able to get away from it. And then
what's going to happen, you think, when that bomb goes off?
There's going to be a lot of people hurt. There's not a lot of people dead. I might be one of the persons that's lying in my grave or something, but I ain't going to go out and I'm not going out without taking somebody with me.
Has it ever happened that you've actually shot or killed someone?
Yeah, I don't know if I killed them. No, I shot a lot of people.
A lot of people? More than one?
Oh, yeah. I was staying on the south side, and a guy stole my car. And I knew who it was who stole it. And he came down the street, and I had it sawed off 14. And I shot him with the 14.
Shotgun?
And I shot him. And this was the same week. A lady tried to set me up with the police. She worked for the police. And she came there from money, and I was straight for her. I had threw her off straight for her, broke all her ribs. But, I've been doing a lot better though. Because I respect everybody else, because everybody's trying to work with me. They could have been like a lot of these hospitals. You don't have insurance? Fuck you. You gone. We cannot help you. Okay? But these staff up here, I know I didn't hurt a lot of them. Because I didn't cuss them out, threaten them. But they didn't let it get to them, they still help.
Well, you're trying to help, and that's some of the things we're doing. We're trying to help you while you're here. And you helping us with this film is really helping us a lot.
Right. I just want everybody to know, if I can get cured, anybody can get cured.
So looking at this individual in the video, some things I'll encourage you to do here is to pause the video and go back through the criteria that we talked about and look at which things he reported that are consistent with the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. And also, are there pieces that you don't feel like you yet know enough to say if he qualified or not? Also look at what information you have about the timeline, but go through and think about the case and think about what would lead you to this diagnosis or not. Some other things to think about is he said a lot of interesting things that were often contradictory. For example, talking about how he would never hurt a woman, but then he gives a story about breaking a woman's nose. So how do you make sense of those kinds of inconsistencies? What do you do with them? How do you think them through, or all the kinds of pieces that I encourage you to consider in the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder for this individual. Now we're going to move on to talking about borderline personality disorder. And borderline personality disorder is probably the disorder that you are most commonly going to see presented on TV, even if they're not presenting it particularly well. But it often gets a lot of attention because people with borderline personality disorder often have behavior that is fairly outrageous at times, can be very difficult to deal with. So this often becomes something that is portrayed on TV. But what we see with borderline personality disorder is a pattern where they have a lot of instability across their interpersonal relationships, their sense of themselves and how they see themselves, and their emotional expression and their range of emotional expression. And this is included with also having a lot of impulsivity. So they tend to have vast changes in behavior, self-image, their affect, and in their relationships. So when we see this, we need to see at least 5 different symptoms, and I'll describe each of these symptoms. So first, an extreme fear of abandonment. And this fear of abandonment leads them to engage in a variety of behaviors that are attempts to avoid being abandoned, whether it's facing real abandonment or just abandonment that they are thinking they might experience in their head. So one example of this would be from the movie Fatal Attraction, which many of you probably have not seen, but again, it's an important movie to see if you want to be in a psychology field. But Fatal Attraction had a character played by Glenn Close, and she was facing her lover leaving her, and she got very upset, and then she asked him to just give her a hug goodbye. And when she gave him the hug, she put her hands on his face and then draped it down his face. And it was very, very dramatic because red streaks were left on his face where she had touched him. And we found out that she had gone in the bathroom and slit her wrists and then left this blood dripping down his face. And so this was also demonstrating some of the other types of symptoms that we're going to talk about in a moment. But the goal here was to make him not leave, not abandon her. So lots of different ways where people might engage in an effort to keep the person with them to avoid having to face abandonment by someone else. People with borderline also tend to have an unstable and intense relationship history where they will alternate between valuing people and thinking they are the best person in the world. Then all of a sudden they think that they are horrible and they devalue them and they hate them. And this can be something that flips with almost no provocation and can be something that flips within moments. So imagine you meet someone and they're your new bestie and you think they're amazing and they're wonderful and they can do all these things and they're best person ever, but then they forget to call you back. And now you think they're terrible and you hate them and you wish something terrible would happen to them because they've hurt you so badly. Identity disturbance. Individuals with borderline personality disorder often have this changing sense of who they are because they don't have the same stability in their identity that most of us experience. So for most of us, we can talk about the interests that we've had since childhood and that we have a career goal, and that career goal is consistent with our interests or our efforts or our values. And they tend to be relatively stable. But individuals with borderline personality disorder often will experience a lot of instability in how they see themselves, what they see as their core goals, their interests, their values, and often they are changing to match and align with whoever their new kind of person is, whether it's a love interest or a friendship. So they might change their goals, change religious beliefs, begin to act very differently, change their major because they're trying to fit and align with some new person in their life. And if that person then betrays them in some way or is not as committed to them, they may find somebody new, and now they're switching to match up with that new person. So again, this isn't talking about normal uncertainty about what you may want for the future. It's not talking about those who might have changed their major once or twice. This is really someone who their core sense of who they are, what they value, what are their life goals, what are the things that are important to them, very significantly, and seem to be dictated by whims related to other people instead of a core sense of their own self. You also look for them to demonstrate impulsivity in at least 2 separate areas, and these are ways that they are being impulsive that actually put them at risk for having some self-harm or some kind of damage to themselves. So this might be excessive binge eating, uh, drinking and using drugs, compulsive shopping, promiscuity, engaging in unsafe sex practices, reckless driving, and we could go on and on and on. So there's a variety of ways in which they might engage in behaviors that are self-damaging, but you're looking for them doing so impulsively, and they're doing this in at least 2 separate ways. You'd also look for recurrent suicidal or self-injurious behavior. Here, if it's suicide behavior, you might see that there are frequent but non-serious attempts at suicide, perhaps taking 10 aspirin as an example. But as you remember from our lecture on suicide, just because it is a non-serious attempt, meaning that what they did was not actually lethal, we still have to take these seriously because it can sometimes lead to death. And even if they are just doing it to get attention and to help retain those friendships and those relationships, they could end up doing it and doing so in a way that is eventually successful. So they're engaging in the suicidal behavior often because they're trying to get the people around them to show that they care about them, or they're trying to relieve the pain, or they're trying to solidify those relationships. They may also engage in self-injurious behavior that wasn't a suicide attempt, and this can be cutting, burning, scratching, punching themselves. And when looking at self-injurious behavior, it's important to talk to the person about what was their end goal, what was the purpose of the behavior, because people can engage in the exact same behavior for completely different reasons, and the reasons why they're engaging the behavior may impact our treatment and our therapeutic process. For example, some people will talk about engaging in self-injurious behavior because they are so empty and numb that if they cause themselves some physical pain, it allows them to at least feel something and to get rid of that feeling of numbness. Others will talk about hurting themselves in an effort to cover acute pain. So they're in so much emotional pain. It feels so intense that if they cause some physical pain, it helps distract from that emotional pain and lessen some of the acute pain that they're in. Sometimes people will talk about they feel like they should be punished, that they did something wrong or that there's something wrong with them, and so it's a way of punishing them. And others will talk about the pain that they're experiencing is invisible to people, and so at least if they are cutting themselves and they can see the blood, it makes the pain that they're in real in a way that feels very invisible. And some people will cut themselves because they are feeling like they're dissociative, and it helps ground them back in their body. So again, there's a multitude of reasons why people might engage in self-harm. What we want to know is what is their intention for doing it? What is the purpose of doing it? How does it help them, or how do they perceive it as helping them? Because that will impact how we want to go forward with our interventions. Individuals Individuals with borderline personality disorder will also frequently have affective instability, marked mood reactivity, or be emotionally labile. And labile is one of these important words that you want to pay attention to because it's going to come up over and over again. But when we're talking about affective instability or somebody being emotionally labile, think of this more like an emotional roller coaster, where they're going up and they're going down, and this can happen in a very, very short period of time. And so I might be happy, feeling great, and then something small happens, and now I've crashed and I'm super sad, and then maybe I become enraged and I'm lashing out, and I can experience this wide range of emotions within maybe only a few minutes' time. When we talk about borderline personality disorder and this emotional lability, people will often confuse it for the kinds of episodes that we've talked about with bipolar disorder. So I want to take a minute to describe some of the differences. When we talk about bipolar disorder, a couple of things to distinguish it. One, this typically doesn't show up until late adolescence or early adulthood. And when it shows up, they will have, if you remember, the modal number is 4 episodes in a 10-year period. So that might mean they might have 4 months of being in a major depressive episode. They may go immediately into having a manic episode for 2 weeks, but then they may be fine for years and be symptom-free. And then something else may happen at some point where they experience a manic episode or a depressive episode, and they may be symptom-free again for years. And then they may have a manic episode and then again go without any symptoms for years. So for bipolar disorder, they're having distinct episodes at various parts in time, rather than their continuous experience every day, all day, being a change in their mood, these rapid changes in mood. So contrast that with borderline personality disorder, where you are going on this roller coaster ride, where within a day, they may have times where they felt really good and then they crash, and they may have times where they suddenly become enraged and they're lashing out, and then they become very sad. So if you look at the course of a week, they may experience a variety of emotions many, many, many different times, versus someone with bipolar disorder having a week-long experience of pretty much the same intense emotion. Some other things that would help differentiate borderline personality disorder from bipolar disorder is, by it being a personality disorder, that means it's starting early in life. So it starts often in early adolescence. And when it starts, it continues across situations, across time, and across the different people they interact with. So they're pretty much like this all the time in all circumstances, and they are like this from the point that it begins until their death. So again, personality disorders are continuously experienced. They may have times where they're a little bit better or a little bit worse, but the symptoms are there pretty much all the time. Whereas bipolar disorder, they have distinct episodes, and then they typically will revert back to being their normal selves. So that's an important differentiation with the emotionally labile piece of borderline and how we differentiate that from bipolar disorder. People with borderline personality disorder often will also talk about having these feelings of emptiness and just this chronic sense of being empty, of feeling dead inside. They may sometimes go into intense rages, and they find it very difficult to control their anger and control the way that they lash out. And very often the people around them will see that their expression of anger is either inappropriately strong, or they're getting angry about things that most people would not get angry about. And sometimes you will see that they have transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. And the dissociation is often part of why they end up self-mutilating. So they've zoned out, they feel numbed out, they're dissociated. If they engage in self-mutilation, it helps ground them back to their body. It assures them that they are real. It assures them that they still can feel something. Now, I'm sure many of you know this, but I do sometimes get a question about this, so I will go ahead and define. When we talk about transient, we're talking about something that moves. It's not there all the time. So often you'll hear about a transient population. Sometimes they will talk about college students as being a transient population because they come into a city and then they leave that city to go on with the next phase of their life. So the idea of being transient means it comes and it goes. It's not there all the time. Borderline personality disorder has a fairly wide range in the estimates among US adults, where they've said it's anywhere from about 1.5% of the population to some have said almost 6%. When we look at medical centers where people are going to a primary care center, the estimates have been around 6%. But when you look at people that are presenting for outpatient mental health, about 10% of that population will have borderline personality disorder. And when you look at only psychiatric inpatient samples, you find that about 20% of the population will have borderline personality disorder. And so one of the ways to think about this is that it's implying that borderline personality disorder can be severe enough that it can greatly impair their ability to function and to kind of manage their lives. And as a result, they end up having to have some portion of time where they are in a psychiatric inpatient unit. There's also a significant imbalance by gender in who's diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. About 75% are going to be women. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is hotly debated, with some thinking that really these are ways women are socialized to behave, like being more emotional, being more relationship focused, it's changing who they are to map on to what others want of them and people pleasing. And so perhaps borderline personality disorder is a way that the way women are socialized is then being codified in our diagnostic system. And that similar argument has been made for antisocial. And what we know is that there does seem to be something stable in the way clinicians will perceive these behaviors, and they will see them more readily among women. So there is definitely some clinical bias that's at play. But there's also likely that borderline and antisocial personality disorder share some common characteristics as a kind of their underpinning. But then the way men and women are socialized kind of gives them permission to act out in different ways. And that then results in them being more likely to be in either borderline personality disorder if they're female or antisocial personality disorder if they're male. Some other things that are associated with borderline personality disorder, typically they will have a history of abuse, particularly a history of childhood abuse by caretakers. And part of what this does is it interrupts their ability to learn how normal relationships should look and how you go about developing normal relationships. And it can also create a lot of fear because as a child, you are dependent on the adults to take care of you, but if they're also abusing you and you can't get away from it, it can make you constantly afraid that you'll be abandoned and you won't be able to function or take care of yourself. And then that can translate into how you interact later, where you continue to have fears of abandonment and you continue to have difficulty in understanding how to have a happy, healthy, normal relationship. The next disorder in cluster B is histrionic personality disorder. And here what we see is a pervasive pattern of excessive emotionality and attention seeking. And we're going to go into some of the different diagnostic criteria for this. And they have to have at least 5 of the group. But one way to think about this is if you really thought of a stereotyped Southern belle. Typically, again, this will be a woman. She is very dramatic in her displays of emotion. And it's not typically any one person, but the way a Southern belle might be portrayed on movies. But the throwing your head back and pretending to faint, and all of these ways of showing emotion and behaving in ways that are drawing attention and seem overly dramatic and overly showy, but often very shallow. So what are we looking for? Often they will experience a lot of discomfort if they aren't the center of everyone's attention. And so then they will do things to try to become the center of attention. And often this will show up by being inappropriately seductive or having behavior that's very provocative, like trying to use their sexuality and their bodies to draw attention, trying to use their physical appearance to get people to pay attention to them. They will often shift emotions pretty rapidly, but what's really different here is that their expression of their emotions tends to be very shallow. So with borderline, it was really intense emotion that could be very extreme, but here they are having rapid shifts of emotion, but the depth of that emotion is pretty shallow. Often when they talk, they're talking in ways that are very attention seeking. And so they might be overly impressionistic. So they're trying to make a point, but their actual words lack detail and lack substance. So it's more about the theatrical, exaggerated description and way of expressing themselves than anything of real substance. People with histrionic personality disorder also tend to be suggestible. So you can often kind of convince them of things more easily than you might be able to convince others. And part of that is because of their desire to be at the center, desire to pull people in. So they often will do some things that are very people-pleasing. And another characteristic is they tend to consider their relationships to be far more close than others consider them. And this kind of fits the pattern we've been talking about, where they may have very shallow emotions, but they describe it as in these very dramatic ways. Well, here, this may be that other people kind of perceive the relationship as maybe just an acquaintance, or maybe just a burgeoning friendship, where they will think, well, this is my best friend. I adore them so much. But again, things are relatively shallow. The relationships are not really very deep. So in thinking about this, it's also important to think about how we would begin to differentiate this from some of the other personality disorders we've talked about. And one, people with histrionic personality disorder do not typically do any of the antisocial behaviors that we talked about. So they're not conning people, they're not stealing, they're not getting into fights with others, they're not trying to take on, they're doing things to con. So all of those more antisocial behaviors that we talked about with antisocial personality disorder, they tend not to do any of those kinds of things. They also tend to express their emotions in a far more exaggerated manner. And this is a little bit difficult to differentiate, but both antisocial and borderline, they had really strong emotions that could come out of the blue, and they would lash out or act out on them in kind of extreme ways. Here, it's much more like if you imagine somebody on the stage trying to act out the emotion. So they are much more likely to exaggerate. I'm so sad and I'm tearful, and they're describing it, but they don't do things that actually would show that depth of emotion. But they also do engage in impulsivity and recklessness, and they are likely to be manipulative, emotionally manipulative, but they are not likely to do it in the way of like conning other people like you saw with antisocial. One thing that's also important about histrionic is that even my description of using the Southern Belle as my example, that this is often stereotyped as something that women will have, and some have argued that, again, it's an exaggeration of the characteristics that we socialize women to do, like being more provocative, wanting to be the center of attention, the expressions of emotion, like these may be things that women are socialized and rewarded for engaging in them. And then when they are doing it to a point that's aggravating to others, now we say it's a diagnosis. And the interesting piece that does support the idea that there is some clinical bias is that when we do the studies with a structured clinical assessment, we get very similar rates across gender. But when you are doing an assessment without that kind of structure, most clinicians will diagnose a woman with histrionic and a man will not get the same diagnosis, even if he has the same symptoms. So one of my favorite demonstrations of histrionic behavior, and I'm going to qualify this. I've not met her. I cannot diagnose her, so I'm not going to say that she has histrionic personality disorder, but there are behaviors that certainly would qualify as histrionic behavior, is Kenya Moore from the Real Housewives of Atlanta. And I'm going to show you a quick clip of one of her one example of some of her more problematic behavior. So in this example, she is angry because she feels that several of her friends have been talking about her and saying rude things about her. And so just watch her response, watch how she is showing her distress, and you'll get a pretty good feel for how this is very similar to histrionic behavior.
Woman, I'm educated. I have a pedigree. Don't try to take a dig at me and think I'm not gonna feel that dig, and I'm not, and you're not gonna get a response from that. And I have been all grown 20 years, and I'm still here. I'm still here, and I'm still fabulous.
Well, you better preach now.
Right? Fabulous. Going with the wind, fabulous. Okay? Thank you.
Well, all right now.
I mean, can we all just sit down and talk about it? I'm going to bed. Good night, ladies.
So what you see here is in the midst of this argument where she's claiming to be so angry, she does this twirling response and even conjures the "gone with the wind, fabulous," and does this spinning and twirls her way all the way off of the patio deck. And that is just not what we typically anticipate for a set of behaviors if somebody is so angry and so distraught that her friendship network has been saying something negative about her. So again, very theatrical, claiming an intense amount of emotion, but the feel of it simply doesn't seem to be, it seems more shallow than it is genuine. Moving to our next personality disorder here, narcissistic personality disorder. So here what we see is a pervasive pattern of grandiosity. And this can be grandiosity that you'd actually see because their behavior is doing it, but it may also be things that they fantasize about in their head. So a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for adoration from others, and a lack of empathy from others. And we see this show up in at least 5 different ways. So a grandiose sense of their own importance, preoccupation with fantasies that they are this incredibly successful person, or that they are so incredibly brilliant, they have tons of power, they're amazingly attractive, or they have this love story that is unlike that of any other. They may believe that they are special, and that they are unique in a way that can only be understood by other people that are equally special in importance. And it's even likely that they may believe that they should not have to associate with mere mortals, or that they should only have to bother spending their time with other people that are equally important and special like them. They need to have adoration from others, but that this level of admiration they need to experience from others is often perceived as being quite excessive and over the top. And often they feel entitled to have special treatment from others, and they expect that their desires and wishes will be fulfilled by others because they are an incredibly special, wonderful, amazing person. They also are very likely to exploit others interpersonally, meaning that they are going to take advantage of other people so that they can have their own needs met. And especially if they perceive these individuals as being beneath them and kind of the relative hierarchy, they're very likely to feel that it's okay to exploit someone to get their needs met. Typically, they do not have much empathy for others. They find it difficult to recognize what other people feel, but certainly have a difficult time feeling concern about the sadness or the hurt someone else might experience. And one of the ironic things is that they are often envious of other people, or they might believe that others are envious of them, which that part feels very consistent, but it's often strange to people to think that they envy others. But typically what you would see with that is that they may look at what others have and believe that they are entitled to have those same things, and so they envy the fact that somebody else has this particular thing that they do not have. Often, though, their behavior and attitudes are arrogant. Some might even qualify as haughty, but they believe that they are above others, and it ends up showing in their beliefs and attitudes. So some of the things we would look at if we're trying to differentiate some of these cluster B disorders is to think about the grandiosity that might be different from some of the other ones. So grandiosity is the key characteristic for narcissistic personality disorder. So similar to the other things we've talked about, they also do long for attention from others, but they specifically need to be adored, and they want others to be envious of them. So they're not looking for quality time and connectedness. That's not part of what is of interest in them. They need others to kind of gaze upon them and envy them and adore them. What often happens is they believe that they have achieved perfection, and they may be angry that others don't recognize how wonderful and great they are. And so it's a part of what people have used to help differentiate the two. So if you think about histrionic personality disorder, it's often this sense of like, look at me, please, somebody look at me. Whereas narcissistic is more like, I'm so amazing, everybody in this room should be looking at me. So it's a subtle differentiation, but hopefully, despite it being audio, you kind of catch how they feel a bit different in the room. Despite all of this, one of the interesting things is that those with narcissistic personality disorder often have a very fragile self-esteem, and they are very, very sensitive to being criticized. So even though they might hide it, they're often haunted by criticism or by being defeated in some way. And as a result, they will feel humiliated, degraded, hollow, even empty. And because those feelings are so distasteful for them, they're likely to react with rage and a defiant counterattack against the person that made them feel that way, or they feel made them feel that way. So unlike borderline and histrionic, this one is similar to antisocial in that it is far more likely to be diagnosed with in men than it is in women. So this is the end of our cluster B personality disorders. We're going to move into cluster C. So if you need a break, this is a good time to take a break and then come and rejoin the lecture. So moving into our cluster B personality disorders. So remember, this is the cluster where individuals tend to be much more fearful and avoidant. Our first one is avoidant personality disorder. And here we see a pervasive pattern of social inhibition, feeling that they are inadequate, and being extremely, extremely sensitive to having any negative evaluation of them or of something they're doing. And this tends to be quite extreme, and you see this showing up in at least 5 of the following ways. So they may avoid any work activity that would require a lot of contact with others and could bring rejection, criticism, or disapproval. Now, this may sound very similar to our social anxiety disorders. So the thing to think about is how pervasive is it, how consistent, and how extreme is it? So 2, they're unwilling to get involved with people unless they are 100% certain that those people are going to like them. And if they have any doubt that they will be liked by those other people, they will not participate and not involve themselves with those individuals. When they are in a relationship, they hold back quite a bit. And this is because they are so incredibly sensitive or afraid that they'll be shamed or they will be ridiculed by the other person. And they become preoccupied with the idea that someone will reject them or criticize them in a social situation. And so they will focus in on this, pay attention, be on guard against this, and see it in interactions that most people would not think of as having been critical or rejecting. And then they are inhibited when they enter into a new interpersonal situation because they see themselves as being inadequate and they think that others are going to pick up on that and criticize them or shame them. They see themselves as being socially inept, as inferior to others, and as unappealing. And they become unwilling or reluctant to take personal risks because they want to avoid something happening that would make them embarrassed. So this is often going to be comorbid with a social anxiety disorder. It could easily lead to agoraphobic behaviors. They may also have dependent personality disorder. But one of the things here is the goal of avoidant personality is to avoid humiliation and rejection. When we talk about dependent personality disorder, they are more focused on making sure they are taken care of. So those with avoidant personality disorder are often very lonely. They long for relationships, but they are extremely sensitive and they're prone to feel rejected and degraded and mocked. And this can be so significant that they don't allow themselves to get into the relationships that could lead to something better or lead to somebody taking care of them because they are so concerned that they will be embarrassed or shamed. So when you look back at their history, you often see that they have a long, long history of being shy and isolating themselves from others, being terrified of strangers, and being terrified of entering into new situations. This often is something you'll see started in childhood, but sometimes may have even begun in infancy. Next is dependent personality disorder. Here you see this pervasive and excessive need to have people take care of them and to ensure that somebody will be there to take care of them. They're willing to be very, very submissive, tend to be very clingy, and be terrified of being separated. And this can show up in any of these 5 different ways. So 1, they have difficulty making everyday decisions unless they get lots of reassurance and lots of advice from other people. And this can really be very minor decision making. You know, which of my 3 white shirts should I wear today? And they cannot make the decision without somebody else giving them lots and lots of advice on what to wear and why, and reassuring that the choice they made was a good choice. They will not take responsibility for their life. They need others to take responsibility for them and to make as many decisions as possible. They tend to refuse to disagree because they are fearful that if they do disagree with someone, that person will no longer approve of them and they may no longer support them and take care of them. They will often have a difficulty in starting new things or doing things on their own because they feel that they don't have the kind of abilities and they don't have the confidence or the judgment to do those kind of things. So this is different from what we saw with anhedonia and depression, where they no longer had the kind of energy or motivation to do these things. Here, they're not engaging in new behaviors or initiating new projects because they don't think they're capable of doing it, that they're going to mess it up, that they're not smart enough, they don't have the skills to do it. And they will go to excessive lengths to make sure that other people will nurture and support them, even if that means volunteering to do something really horrible and unpleasant. They will do it to gain favor and to ensure that the people around them will continue to like them and take care of them. When they're alone, they will often feel like they are helpless. It's incredibly uncomfortable to be alone because they have these exaggerated beliefs that they are not going to be able to take care of themselves. So they'll do everything in their power to avoid having time alone. And if a relationship ends, their goal is to immediately find a new relationship where somebody else will begin to take care of them again and support them again. And when they are in these relationships, when they are out of the relationships, but even if they are in a good, stable relationship, they are constantly preoccupied that they're going to be left alone and have to care for themselves. So when you think about what all these symptoms would look like if put together, these individuals also often will be very pessimistic and have a lot of self-doubt. They will typically belittle their abilities and the things they might bring to the table for a relationship or otherwise. They will often talk about themselves in ways that are really negative, like calling themselves stupid. If somebody criticizes them, they will take it as proof that it is true, and that it is an indication of the fact that they do not have any value or worth. And they will also kind of quickly attach themselves to anyone that will allow it so that they can be cared for by somebody else. Behaviorally, what you see is that they are often submissive, they cling on to others, and if rejected, they tend to respond with being even more submissive and trying to please that other person into liking them again rather than reacting with rage. They are often docile and will be self-effacing rather than kind of that flamboyant attention seeking that we saw with histrionic disorder. And they will seek out and hold on to relationships no matter how badly they are treated, rather than being fearful of rejection to the point where they will avoid even trying to have a relationship, like we see with avoidant personality disorder. So this is another one that is more typically diagnosed with women, but again, when they do structured surveys, they tend to find that there are equal rates across gender. So it appears that there is something going on in potential clinical bias because our structured surveys do not show the same bias. Our last disorder, personality disorder in this category, is an interesting one because it has a name, unfortunately, that's very similar to another disorder. So obsessive-compulsive personality disorder is very, very different from obsessive-compulsive disorder that we've already talked about. And so understanding what's similar, understanding what's different about these is very, very important. You should expect that at some point in the near future, you will be asked to make a differentiation between obsessive compulsive disorder and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. So, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, or OCPD, is a pervasive pattern that crosses time, situations, and people where they are preoccupied with being very orderly, perfectionistic, and maintaining personal control at the expense of being inflexible, not being open, and not even being effective and efficient in what they're trying to do. So we look at this and we look for at least 4 different symptoms. So one, being so preoccupied with being orderly or following the rules that the point of what they were actually trying to do ends up getting lost. For example, they may create an incredibly detailed to-do list, and it's the to-do list with subcategories and then subcategories of subcategories. And so they've spent so much time getting the to-do list perfect that they never actually get anything on the to-do list done. They often will engage in a level of perfectionism that ends up interfering with their ability to actually complete the task. So again, they might keep rewriting and rewriting and rewriting the title of their paper and the first paragraph, and they have to write the perfect paper, so they never end up getting past writing that first paragraph. Typically, they are excessively devoted to work and to being productive, to the exclusion of having friendships, engaging in fun, or resting. And they tend to be overly conscientious. They are often inflexible about their moral rules and values, even if they seem really unreasonable or interfere with their ability to enjoy their lives. Often they will not discard items, even if they are worn out, broken, they don't have any value, but they can't get rid of these worthless objects, even though they don't have particular sentimental value. Meaning, many of us may have something that's sentimental to us, even though we can't actually use it, or it might be broken at this point, but we keep it for that sentimental value. These individuals will keep something even though it does not have any sentimental value to them. Because they have to have everything precisely the way they want it, they find it very difficult to delegate tasks to others. And if they do delegate tasks, they are often only willing to do so if the person will do it exactly the way they believe it has to be done. Often they refuse to spend any money. They're very miserly, and they will hoard money for a future catastrophe. And overall, they tend to be incredibly stubborn and rigid. For example, they believe that they are right no matter what information you give them that proves that they are not right. So you would think a person like this would be very, very critical of others, and believe that their way is the best and is very perfectionistic, but often, ironically, they are also very self-critical. And you may see some social detachment, but their social detachment is often due to their excessive work and their discomfort with emotions, not a fundamental lack of the capacity for intimacy like we see with schizoid. So if you are trying to differentiate obsessive-compulsive personality disorder from obsessive-compulsive disorder, some of the things to think about. With obsessive-compulsive disorder, you have to have obsessive thoughts, and those obsessive thoughts lead you to engage in compulsions that help to relieve the anxiety that your obsessions created. So the obsession creates anxiety, they engage in a compulsion, the compulsion makes the anxiety go away for a little while, but that obsession comes back again. If you notice, with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, we did not mention any obsessions or compulsions. Instead, they just have a way of doing things that is very orderly, very rigid, very moralistic, but it's not an obsession and compulsion the way we see it with OCD. However, you could have individuals that have obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and on top of that, they also have obsessions and compulsions. If that is the case, they should be given both diagnoses. Another thing to help differentiate these individuals is people with obsessive compulsive disorder may not be perfectionistic at all. They may not be rigid. They may not be particularly orderly. Think about what we talked about with things like hoarding behaviors. So someone with OCD could have any number of compulsive behaviors, but it doesn't mean that they are perfectionistic and orderly. But the cornerstone of obsessive compulsive personality disorder is that orderly, rigid, perfectionistic behavior. And you may have noticed that I talked about people with obsessive compulsive personality disorder being unwilling to get rid of items that have no value, even if they are no longer functioning. They may be broken or worn out. And so if that is very extreme, and so they've acquired a lot of belongings and they no longer can function in their space, then they may also qualify for hoarding disorders. But that would again be a time where they got both diagnoses. And by and large, most individuals will not have the hoarding be so extreme that it would qualify for hoarding disorder. So that finishes our description of all of the different personality disorders. But we also want to talk a little bit about how the personality disorders are problematic and how the way we classify personality disorders in the DSM can create some challenges. So one of the number one challenges when we talk about personality disorders, and we've actually already talked about this a bit in our class and talking about some other things, is the idea that the way they are placed in the DSM is categorical. Like we have these, even the clusters, we have the 3 clusters, and then within the clusters, we have the different disorders. So people kind of go into a box and that's the category they belong in, right? But many have made the argument that maybe we should be thinking about personality disorders as dimensional. And some of the reasons why people think about this is when we look at personality more generally, we measure personality dimensionally. If you think about other big categories for personality, like openness to new experiences, neuroticism. These are all things that we measure them along a dimension where some people are seen as having more or less of them. It's not you are either a neurotic or you are either an open person. You have more or less openness, more or less neuroticism. And so it's interesting to many that then for the personality disorders, we abandon the dimensional perspective and we just shove people into a box. Another reason why people question if we should be looking at these categorically is that it's difficult to figure out where the line should be drawn for individuals having these kind of personality traits, but maybe they don't meet the threshold for a diagnosis. And where should we be drawing that line? So some of the pieces of this, well, even though we have the clusters, they haven't consistently been validated. So the way we've broken down our categories doesn't seem to be consistent and clear. And also, we would expect that the personalities should be pretty distinct from one another, but in reality, there's a lot of overlap. In fact, when individuals can be diagnosed with a personality disorder, the modal number of personality disorders that they can have diagnosed is 4. So think about what that means. That means if you do qualify for any of the personality disorders, then most likely there's at least another 3 that you should be diagnosed with. So we're rarely seeing any of the personality disorders as a standalone diagnosis. They are frequently co-occurring with one another. And there's only 10 of them, but they're frequently co-occurring with 4 personality disorders. So this implies that there must be a lot of overlap in the disorders, that they're not being clearly differentiated, And that hints at the idea that maybe they're not categories, they're really more dimensions, and we should be rating people on dimensions instead of trying to put them into a categorical box. To address this, the current DSM has begun to look at an alternative model that's currently in the research and future consideration section of the DSM. And they're looking at impairments in personality and pathological personality traits, such as negative affectivity or lack of inhibition, antagonism, detachment, things like this. And they're looking at these pathological personality traits and then seeing how those may more appropriately map onto and define the most distinctive personality disorders. So that's some of the debate about, are personality disorders categorical or are they dimensional? There's also challenges in the way that they're labeled. For one, we have OCD and OCPD. So the idea that the obsessive-compulsive disorder and then obsessive-compulsive personality disorder are, the labels for those two disorders is confusing and it's challenging. And when we look at the personality disorders, the explanations for the different personality disorders are really difficult to distinguish how they are different from other personality disorders. We also know that there are significant challenges in the clinical bias that we bring to the table in diagnosing these disorders, and that a lot of the biases appear to have a ring of sexism that's influencing them. So sexist beliefs we have about what's normal for women and men seem to be coded in the criteria themselves, and that may be contributing to us diagnosing these differently for men and women in ways that really are not necessarily appropriate. The personality disorders are also historically extremely difficult to treat. So difficult to treat that in the past, if individuals had a diagnosis of a personality disorder, insurance companies would often deny treatment because they were seen as things that you couldn't do anything to help. You couldn't treat them, you couldn't change them, you couldn't help them. And part of this is the fact that they are egocentric. So the person sees them as being consistent with how they see the world, how they see themselves. It's their normal way of behaving all of the time. And because it's this enduring part of their personality, it's very difficult to treat, but also people don't tend to seek treatment. If you don't think of your behavior as part of the problem, you're unlikely to seek treatment for your behavior. That probably just makes sense. The treatment that's needed for personality disorders is also incredibly intensive, and this makes it incredibly expensive. So one of the #1 treatment modalities for borderline personality disorder is called dialectical behavioral therapy. And this treatment protocol often requires nonstop 2-year intervention, and that intervention often requires an individual session, group sessions, check-in calls with a therapist, and weekly homework that often requires daily interactions. And people are committing to do this for a full 2 years in order to see notable change in the severity of their personality disorder. However, it's successful. They have found that DBT is able to significantly reduce the problematic behaviors and change the cognitions of people that have borderline personality disorder, and can help them move into having very stable, healthy relationships, emotions, and interactions with others. But that's a lot to commit to, and it's very, very expensive. Also, there are not many people that specialize in treating personality disorders. Some of this is because stereotypes that therapists have, that these people are very difficult to work with and deal with. So many therapists may not want to work with them. And in fact, some have talked about being labeled with a personality disorder as a death sentence with regard to treatment, because very few people will work with them. And there's very few people that specialize in the skills that are required to work with them. And this is also one of the places where the Mental Health Parity Act has been really helpful and has been important. The Mental Health Parity Act gave people access to accessing care, and accessing care that was more affordable. And we've already talked about this several times in class, but the Mental Health Parity Act made it so that if an insurance or if a company was going to offer medical care for physical health problems, they had to offer comparable care for mental health conditions. Meaning that they had to allow individuals to have similar copays and similar deductibles, and that if they did not limit the number of sessions they could have for physical medical health, that they could also, that they would not be able to then limit the number of sessions for mental health care. And this is actually incredibly important, because if you need to see someone for multiple sessions a week, those deductibles and copays can become cost prohibitive to seeking care. In the past, insurance companies may have said, well, you can have unlimited physical health care, but mental health care is a separate deductible. It may be $1,000 deductible, and that your copays were 50% of the cost. So every time you went to the therapist, they might pay $75, but you would also have to pay $75. So imagine if you had to pay $75 multiple times a week over the course of 2 full years in order to get better. The chances that people can afford that treatment are very, very low. Now, in talking about the different personality disorders, I have brought up several times some of the challenges about the course of the disorder, but I do want to talk about this a little bit more once again. One, these are disorders that tend to show up very early in life, and when they show up, they tend to remain fairly stable, and then they persist throughout the life course. So people typically, you would not expect that they're going to get better, and you would expect that many of the symptoms for many of these disorders are going to get worse. Some of the exceptions to that would be thinking about antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder and some of the more externalizing behaviors. It's kind of a horrible way of framing it, but people will often say, you know, if somebody has antisocial, just lock them up until their 40s, and by then you can let them go and they'll no longer be that much of a harm to society. And what that's really referring to is that in the 40s, largely due to some of the significant shifts in hormones like testosterone, the overt externalizing really problematic behaviors that we tend to see with antisocial and even borderline personality disorder tend to drop off. So they may still engage in a lot of the emotional manipulation and some of the kind of the being emotionally labile, but they will most likely no longer act out in the physically aggressive ways and those really disturbing externalizing behaviors that we see.